Right. Well, I think we will, aim to start promptly. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to IISS. My name is Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk here at IISS, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Robert Lambert. I was going to introduce him as an old friend of IISS, but given his encouragingly youthful demeanour, I will rephrase that and call him a long-standing friend of IISS. And it's nice to see you back here, Bob. Robert Lambert has had a long and distinguished career with the Metropolitan Police in what used to be called the Special Branch, which subsequently was merged into the Special Operations divisions of the Metropolitan Police, and in particular has a history of engagement with Islamic communities in the run-up to and after 9/11, and that constitutes the subject of a book which he has just published. I think it's coming out imminently, and for those of you interested, there are flyers in the entrance to this conference room if anyone would like to pick one up. I think it's fair to say that please carry on, that the techniques developed by Dr. Lambert and which are detailed in his book have generated considerable controversy, particularly when it comes to issues of engagement with individuals and groups espousing views widely seen as incompatible with perceived UK interests, things like the treatment of women and so on. But I will leave you, Bob, to make your own account of this, and without any further ado, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and thank you to everyone at IISS for the kind invitation. Thanks to all of you for coming, and special thanks for some of you who have worked with me in the past. I think it's a particular tribute because you will know that I haven't really changed my assessment, my ideas in this field for quite a long time, and that might be something of value to those of you listening to my account for the first time, because it has been said to me recently, well, listen, Bob, it's all well and good coming out with these ideas now. You've retired from the police. It's a shame we didn't hear from you when you were working for the Metropolitan Police. Well, that's why I'm pleased some former colleagues are here, because really I was able to make the same kind of cases, the same kind of arguments when I was serving in the Metropolitan Police. But of course, I didn't then seek out public platforms and didn't feel the need then to write a book. So I think it's fair to say that the book is a journey. Tony Blair has been reflecting on 10 years since 9/11. He's written a book, and again recently he's reflected on the 10th anniversary. And I think it is interesting that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, that Tony Blair's sense of how best to respond to 9/11 was rather different to the initial responses that I had and that I had shared with colleagues in the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. And I think it's useful just to begin there, actually. I know we've all been looking back recently on the last 10 years. It is perhaps helpful that the book comes out at this time. I think it is very much in that genre of reflecting on the last 10 years, also looking forward. When Tony Blair left Brighton, he was attending a party conference in Brighton when he heard the news of 9/11, and he got a train back to London. And it's pretty clear from his book that he was quick to perceive the way to respond to 9/11. And I think it's quite powerful testimony to the sense that he would be receptive to thinking that he encountered when he went to Washington, along the lines that 9/11 introduced something that has become known since in academic and practitioner circles as new terrorism. And on that basis, a lot of what went before, becoming old terrorism, was not necessarily so vitally important. And it's fair to say that many of us who were practitioners in the field of old terrorism or old counter-terrorism, I think we quickly came to see that some of our experience, we might have to work hard to convince politicians like Tony Blair that some of that prior experience was still important. And really quite telling, I think. It's quite significant because really it was possible, and it is still possible, to conceive Tony Blair thinking, for example, that his experience in Northern Ireland, which was very contemporary at the time, that might have some bearing on how best to respond to 9/11. But I think he was clear that it wouldn't have any bearing, and it seems 10 years later that he is equally clear. So, lessons from history. I think appropriately the first section of the book is called King's Cross, and this is the part of London. Many of you, of course, will know King's Cross. You'll know that it's on the Victoria line, and what you may not know is that there's a small police station in King's Cross, not far from where several Russian revolutionaries resided in an earlier era. But certainly in 2002, that's where myself and colleagues first worked in this new and small unit, Muslim contact unit, looking to engage with Muslim leaders in London. And I'm delighted to see that some of those leaders and figures are here today. And it's also, I think, important, and it seemed clear to us at the time, that Al-Qaeda was equally interested in history. Al-Qaeda strategists, people like al-Suri, always looking back to campaigns that had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and to see what lessons they might learn. I think in this first section of the book, the King's Cross section, I'm also able to go back to this era when, in fact, my grandfather was policing London. Ernest Lambert, like myself, retired from the Met as an inspector, and during his period of service in London, indeed it was anarchist terrorists who were causing my, if you like, my predecessors, some of the first members of Special Branch, to be very closely involved in bomb plots, bombings of London, attempts to bomb London. And again, I'm able to just draw out some very interesting parallels between the most recent bombing campaigns in London and some of the earlier ones. There's one thing, it interests me, a parallel whereby, you invariably find bombers who lack skill. The Al-Qaeda inspired campaign in London, I mean, it would have been hugely more successful from the terrorist point of view if only the operatives, the foot soldiers, had a degree of skill that, they've been sadly lacking. And of course, often, as a result of their lack of skill, they end up in prison whereas the intention that they had was to end up in paradise. So their failure is significant, whereas in earlier eras, unsuccessful bombers, whether they be anarchist or whether they be Fenian or Irish Republican, when they fail, often they get killed, which is an opposite outcome, but it's one that what they share is insufficient skill. In terms of skill and commitment, one thinks of Anders Breivik, but we'll come on to him in a little while. There is a wonderful juxtaposition which is significant between this anarchist era and the modern era, a very important one which is brought to light by a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, Joe Ballman, and he I think very powerfully uses modern-day Muslims, Muslim community figures, again, some of whom I've worked with, to deliver the anarchist speeches of 100 years ago. And again, in doing that, I think that juxtaposition tells us that there is probably more continuity alongside the obvious changes involved. And, you know, myself and colleagues, we also, I think, immediately after 9/11, you know, we felt a sense of continuity with the first attack on the World Trade Center. I was one of several special branch officers who assisted the FBI in 1993, when really, really the terrorists on that occasion came very close to bringing down one or both of the Twin Towers, very close. I mean, it only, you know, as you recall or you can see, I mean, it was a bomb in the basement, in the car park basement, but enormously powerful. And really, I mean, why wouldn't you look back to that? Because in fact, the tactics may have been different, but not dramatically different. The motivation appeared to be very, very similar. And I would say this, and of course, you know, it's easy with hindsight, and of course, at the time we didn't really appreciate the extent to which the war on terror might pull us far, far away from the response in '93. But it is worth saying that the investigative response in '93 was excellent, it was outstanding, it was professional, it was everything you'd expect from the FBI, supported by the Metropolitan Police. Interestingly, it involved making a request for assistance to a Muslim student organisation, FOSIS, the Federation of Islamic Student Societies. A request, very simple one, you know, this is a terrorist investigation, can you assist us? We have a suspect, a terrorist suspect who went to Swansea University, we'd like some assistance. And you know, it's much easier to get support for inquiries of this nature when you are sticking to the rule of law. It would only become apparent later if I was making a similar request for assistance in 2004, 2005. Invariably, both the operational, the military aspects and the political aspects of the war on terror obviously made it harder to win support, but never so hard that you couldn't still get the kind of support that was needed. The second section of the book moves us sort of seamlessly northbound on the Victoria line, just two stops up to Finsbury Park, and this was certainly a very regular tube journey for myself and colleagues, not least of all on the first anniversary of 9/11, when Abu Hamza, who some of you will remember, who had, if you like, had illegitimate or unlawful control of the mosque at the time. Abu Hamza, other extremists in the London scene were celebrating the first anniversary of 9/11 in the way that is probably quite clear. And perhaps it wasn't at that time, perhaps it wasn't sufficiently clear, at least to outsiders, the extent to which Abu Hamza and others at Finsbury Park were facilitating, I think, real support for Al-Qaeda, and certainly very real support in the sense of propaganda. But I think it soon, from an operational point of view, it became clear that if you like, the public face of Hamza and these kind of public meetings, were just the tip of the iceberg. It's also important to note that this kind of event drew to Finsbury Park another kind of extremists, that's to say British National Party, National Front, and forerunners of the English Defence League. I mean, I'm still working on this, but I actually have some notes from 2004 which show some groups coming to Finsbury Park Mosque and using that name. I mean, it's just a footnote, because I think English Defence League, as we know them now, do often get dated more recently from a formation in Luton. But suffice to say, it was something that Nick Griffin was very quick to pick up on, very quick. And although Nick Griffin's seminal account of what's wrong with Islam was written just before 9/11 and followed the Northern riots in the same year, Griffin certainly found that both 9/11 itself and the response to 9/11 led by George Bush, Tony Blair, he certainly found that it enabled the BNP to campaign and begin to campaign sometimes almost exclusively against Islam and against Muslims. And this account of Islam really has come to dominate a lot of thinking over the last 10 years. And I think it's also accounted for my own parallel interest in attacks on Muslims, because I think it was in 2002 when I was going to a mosque in the sort of one of the outer suburbs in East London. I was asking questions about Al-Qaeda. The chairman and the committee at the mosque, they didn't really know much about Al-Qaeda. I mean, why should they, perhaps? What they did know, and what they only said to me after about 20 minutes of polite conversation, was that their mosque had been firebombed the evening before. I then went to inspect the damage, and since then I think I've visited over 100 mosques that have been attacked, either firebomb attacks or all the way through to attacks where they've had bricks thrown through the window. But I mention that because I think it's probably one of the unintended consequences of the war on terror. Sure, there's Islamophobia way before 9/11, but I think there is something quite specific to the last 10 years. I haven't found any, or many, well, no, to be honest, I don't think there's any Muslim leaders or mosque chairmen who point to serious attacks on their mosques before 9/11. And so, not surprising, and one might say that really, whether it's the BNP, whether it's the English Defence League, if they come to protest in the street against Abu Hamza here's leading press in the street, I mean, one would have to concede that they have found what they are objecting to. They object to Islamic extremism, or they object to a version of Islam that they read about in the Sun newspaper. And in this man, they found it. So, I was always conscious that, in a sense, their targeting was not wrong when they came to object to this man. What I have objected to since is when they come to target the very organisations, Muslim organisations, who were successful in challenging this man, which talks very much to that, and difficult at times to not to acknowledge some of the unintended humour that might arise on these occasions. Actually, sometimes the intelligence for the far right wasn't all that good. They turned up on a Friday to protest against Hamza, but actually he'd already gone to prison. So they soon realised that they were dealing with Hamza's deputy, and difficult even for experienced special branch officers. Difficult just to maintain a sort of a discreet presence when the chant rings out. You know, Friday lunchtime, not I think just before prayer start, but the chant rings out. You know, where's your Hamza now? To the tune of chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep. And then in 2005, what I think you can see on the screen, sort of a new beginning at Finsbury Park, better beginning, and so Hamza's in prison, but his hardcore supporters have been outsmarted, outmaneuvered by some of the Muslims you can see around the mosque. And it's no coincidence that the only two non-Muslims on the screen, both one might say old Labour MPs, I guess, Jeremy Corbyn, Ken Livingstone. I don't think Ken Livingstone would want me to say that, as he's running for mayor and doesn't want to be thought of as old anything, you know. But certainly what they had in common was a sort of something comfortable working with this particular group of Muslims who might easily and would properly be called Islamists or associates of the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. I'm not going to bother to name names at the moment, and similarly I won't bother to name names in respect of I think some of the most notable critics of this approach, because I think after 2005, when it became very clear that myself and colleagues were working in partnership with that group of Muslims, I think that's when we began to come under very serious attack from quite a distinguished range of critics. And just as a sort of as a bit of light relief, if anyone can name the odd one out, sort of thinking, if this was Have I Got News for You, and if you had to name the odd one out, I mean, of course you've got to guess what I'm thinking. I mean, I'm sure there's different ways of approaching this, but if you can guess what who I'm thinking is the odd one out, then with Nigel's permission, you can win a free copy of the book. We're not allowed to sell it, but here is a free copy if you can spot the odd one out. If there's any offers, it's a chunky read. It's in 4 sections, and we're into the second one, so there's only 2 to go. But it's no. Yes. Well, I could see a case for Ed being the odd one out, but actually, sadly, it's not the one in my mind. So unless anyone else wants to have a quick go, then I'm going to have to offer you Gilles Capel, who's at the top in the middle, simply because he's a Frenchman. I think he's a Parisian, and everyone else is a Londoner. And I think it's that, again, not only Londoners, but of course Melanie Phillips, who's in the corner next to Gilles Capel. Of course, she wrote a book, Londonistan, in 2006. Yes, Michael Gove in the glasses, of course, he wrote a book also at the same time, Celsius 77. So yes, if I'm honest, I think those kind of accounts of London, the counter-terrorist threat to London, yes, I think that did initially inspire me to do the PhD research on which the book is largely based, although thankfully it has lightened up a bit since the PhD. And then, of course, it's interesting. I mean, 5 years on from that sort of partnership work, police, local Muslims working together, many of us went back on the 5th anniversary, and we were absolutely thrilled. I mean, for many of us, it was the best bit of community work we'd seen. Yes, it is. I'm not going to go into it all now, but it is in the book, because I think in another book called The Suicide Factory, I think you do get a more sensational account, but hopefully the book 2010 and then this year, 2011, when the mosque is receiving hate mail and poison packages. I think, very much an isolated view. I think the previous characters here, I think, tending to dominate the discourse, suggesting that actually the mosque has simply passed from one set of extremists, perhaps violent extremists, into the hands of non-violent or not violent yet extremists. And, well, in the book, I really do dispute that account. I really do argue quite strongly, because it seems to me that if anyone had spent the amount of time that I spent, that colleagues spent on the streets, in the mosques, in Finsbury Park, and also in Brixton. Brixton is chapter 3 or section 3 of the book. So again, we're sticking to the Victoria line. We're not leaving the Victoria line. There is a temptation to go down the district line to Tower Hamlets. I've resisted that, but it could be a book or a chapter in the future. And so, again, it's a similar story, but an intriguingly different story in Brixton. I think some of the arguments that we've heard over the years why police officers shouldn't regard people like Abdul Haq Baker, the chairman of the mosque, as partners. I mean, I think there's often a recognition that police have to do dirty work, and I think it's Dean Godson at Policy Exchange who first advised me and advised police colleagues, look, we understand police have to work with difficult people, but don't give them legitimacy, don't give them any sense of authority, meet them in a dark alley, which is a very good euphemism for treating them as informants rather than partners. And of course, myself and colleagues, we had experience of this kind of work. We weren't actually steeped in community policing backgrounds. We were special branch officers who knew when, because you always do need to recruit informants, and that's why we were utterly convinced that people like Abdul Haq Baker, who now I'm delighted to say, is also Dr. Baker, who got his PhD at the same time as I did at Exeter. So, partnership working in the police and then partnership working in academia as well. And of course, the work we did in Brixton also told us very quickly that the myth, the myth that Muslim communities aren't doing enough, the myth that Muslim communities are somehow in league with the terrorists, completely dispelled. If only in the Metropolitan Police we'd been sufficiently alert in 1996 when Abdul Haq Baker first came to the police seeking support in dealing with the likes of Al-Faisal, the likes of Abu Qatada. It is, it's one of the sad aspects of the book that, having been warmly embraced by government because of their skills on the streets in Brixton, the Salafis within the prevent world, achieving great status recognition for their youth project called Street. Particularly sad because my son Adam was working for Street when he died suddenly in February this year, and the last conversation I had with him was about trying to keep Street going, well, I think I would never bet against Street and Abdul Haq Baker. I think they will find ways to carry on, but it is quite sad that the current government has tended to see them in this category of somehow being extremist. I think it's best if you ask me questions about. I know, what some of the concerns are, but I won't labour the points unless you want me to. And again, I would perhaps underline this key point as well. I've touched on it. Sometimes I hear ideas that somehow soft policing or community policing is at odds with hard policing or tough policing. I think they're complementary. I think the thing is there is good tough policing and there's good soft policing. That's all I would ever argue, and I certainly would never argue that we don't need to recruit informants, but I argue equally strongly that we probably need to give more thought to partnerships. And finally, you know, just to sort of wrap this up now, really, so you if you want to, you can ask some questions. I think it's also clear that the sort of experience we had, that we'd gained in Special Branch over the years, I mean, some of this is cumulative experience. I honestly believe, I think a lot of this experience was handed down informally from the earliest days. You know, this was a specialist department where, you know, the informal learning, I think, was quite magnificent. And therefore, I think we always understood that the best kind of counterterrorism, whatever the terrorist group or movement, was the most narrowly focused on real terrorists, terrorist suspects, and that it paid off, you know, and I think it still continues to pay off if you keep it as narrowly focused as possible, and, you know, as far as you can, that you you stick to, you know, conventional criminal prosecutions as well. And so Rizvan Sabir, who has been in the news recently since I put this slide together, he's been, I think, been awarded £20,000 by Nottinghamshire Police. Again, I won't go into the whole story, but I think this is just one of many examples over the last 10 years where counterterrorism hasn't been at its best because it hasn't been narrowly focused. It's been tempted to drift into this world of, you know, well, let's see, you know, we probably need to arrest this student. And maybe, you know, I'm not going to comment on the individual case, but I would say that sort of 6 days detention here, you know, should have been more than sufficient to establish that he was not a terrorist. And so, just to conclude, then, this issue of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hate crime. This is, I suppose, where my research interest has developed. And I think, you know, frankly, I think there's a wonderful contrast and interaction between what happens in the counter-terrorist world and what happens in this world. The English Defence League, who knows, you know, they're on a bit of a crest of a wave at the moment, but it's hard to imagine that they will sort of sustain their impetus. It is important, I argue, that we pay more attention to the victims of hate crimes at mosques, people like Mr. Coakley, who, you know, again, I just wonder where the media's imagination is. I mean, you know, the media likes to highlight the bravery victims of most crimes. Well, why not? You know, why not highlight this man's bravery, not just rescuing the Quran, but rescuing the mosque and being prepared to live in the mosque 24/7, knowing that future attacks are very likely. So this is the fact. I just thought this was a good slide to conclude with, and I think it's worth noting that in the final section of my book, so we go King's Cross, Finsbury Park, down to Brixton, and then back up to Victoria. Victoria, it is because that would be the place where myself and colleagues would come to report back, if you like, report back to New Scotland Yard, just down the road, report back to the Home Office, and just to let people know sometimes, you know, difficult messages, what's happening in communities, and perhaps how some communities are being alienated. And maybe, you know, maybe now when we look at the revelations this year around the Murdochs and both senior politicians and senior police officers, maybe we need to learn some lessons there as well. I certainly recall shortly after 7/7 being asked by the Commissioner to visit the Sun headquarters. We were busy trying to deal with 7/7 and then the subsequent attacks on 21/7. And the Sun ran a story then, mad terrorist professor invited to London. And the Met's gone crazy, you know, and you'd get an article from Richard Littlejohn. How does he sort of, you know, can you believe it? You know, the world's gone mad. And that was the sort of pressure that the Commissioner would face at the time. I don't think he was being soft. I think that inviting someone like Tariq Ramadan to talk to young Muslims in this country was, was wholly beneficial. But when we discussed the matter with the editor at The Sun, I think it was Rebecca Wade at the time, now Rebecca Brooks, it was clear that The Sun has a fairly pragmatic agenda. I think by the time we visited, I think the readers of The Sun had voted overwhelmingly to have Tariq Ramadan hung, drawn and quartered. And it's in that same mode that, when Anders Breivik committed his recent atrocity, that The Sun, of course, this is the Guardian's view of The Sun, but not unfair, the sense that that knee-jerk response that this is likely to be Al-Qaeda. I'm going to conclude at that point and welcome any questions, comments you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. Okay, we've got about 25 minutes for questions and comment. Can I ask that if you want to make an intervention, you should begin by identifying yourself and saying which organisation, if any, you represent. So, nobody wants to say anything at all? Yeah, Gordon.
Gordon Carrera from the BBC. Thanks,
Yeah,
Bob.
can you use the microphone just so we can thank you?
Could you get you suggested maybe it would be worth asking about prevent and your view of the changes. There's clearly been a big shift from the new government, with a view that previously groups were being funded who might have had a negative impact, for instance, on community cohesion and aspects like that. In your view, is that a mistake? What was the previous strategy working, did you think, and needed more time? What's your perspective on that?
Go ahead.
Yes, non-violent extremism. Well, I think it's been applied unfairly, and of course, the example I give primarily, because it's there in the heart of my book, is the Brixton example, and so the street project, which was well known, well understood by government, certainly by the civil servants working with street, and in particular the many police officers working with street, recognising that this was an outstanding project that was successful at the sharp end. So the sort of success that I highlight in the book, some of which goes back to the 1990s, not surprisingly, it carried on into the post-7/7 period, into the prevent period. I think it was also good because it had some wonderful lessons for other, perhaps other projects in prevent that may not have had the same sort of experience. The sense you would soon get if you worked with street, you would soon realise that here are very experienced practitioners on the streets who are prepared, when necessary, to stand up and fight their corner, possibly with police, possibly with government, in the sense that in any good partnership, you don't just want members of the community who agree with everything you say. They're prepared to argue. For example, this more widely within prevent, there have been concerns that prevent is spying on Muslim communities. Well, again, a project like Street understands that is counterproductive. That the sort of the youth workers who go out and do very demanding and dangerous work, who are brave, the sort of people who take risks that, say, police officers may get paid to take. But when you actually see members of the community being brave on a voluntary basis and taking risk whether or not they get paid, it's quite something. And their willingness to protect the youth workers is the key thing. And therefore, the sadness that I expressed about Street, it's not just because they've lost their funding, it's because they were a great role model, I think, for how this kind of work needs to be developed. It's not dissimilar to the same sort of skills you see in work against drug crime, you know, the Operation Trident. It's brave and dangerous work, and it's a long way away from some aspects of Prevent which perhaps are framed in a much quieter, tranquil arena.
Okay, thanks very much. Nicholas McLean on the front row.
Thank you. I wondered if I could ask two questions. First is, could you say a word about radicalisation in prison? And the second is, I've visited a number of mosques where I was surprised talking to and looking at the local printed newspapers produced by moderate Muslims, that some of their language, some of their dialogue to their people was, in a way, promoting a sense of grievance and injustice. I'll give you three quick examples. One was that April 1st, April Fool's Day, is specifically aimed at being nasty to Muslims and has a Muslim origin. Second, that 9/11, it was unproven in terms of any connection with Islam. And third, an example of Muslims being picked on for to pay parking fines and other people not. You know, a number of some big things and some small things, but that grievance could eventually be dangerous.
Yes. Well, let's look at the second one first. I mean, I think the examples you give, they do sound like pretty poor grievances that one wouldn't want to see encouraged. So I think, in my experience, this is an area where one needs to make a case-by-case judgment. I mean, perhaps the biggest grievances of all are the political grievances that characters like Abu Hamza exploited. That's what I concentrate primarily on in the book, because I think it's vitally important. I mean, there are some arguments, and again, the sort of critics that I mentioned, critics of the work, would say that the sort of work that I was involved in Finsbury Park was counterproductive, because certainly the grievance against the war in Iraq, the grievance in respect of Israel-Palestine, I mean, you know, there was no attempt, say, by an MP like Jeremy Corbyn to move young people away from those grievances. On the contrary, and if I'm entirely honest, I came to find when on one side of the railway bridge, you know, the main line from King's Cross, separating Finsbury Park, and on Abu Hamza's side of the railway bridge, and we'll just focus on that period around the war in Iraq.
Very exercised about what they saw as a build-up of Islamist extremism in the UK that appeared to be going, you know, unattended. And yet we read in, for example, Brynja Lear's biography of Abu Musab al-Siri that al-Siri and many of his fellow jihadists actually, because they were mirror imaging their experience of Middle Eastern regimes, were expecting the British mukhabarat to come and turn them over at any moment. And indeed, I think al-Siri actually decided to leave the UK because he felt that this was about to happen to him. In retrospect, should we have actually gone to such people and had conversations with them and actually encouraged them to go?
I think there's a possibility there. I must say what I deal with in the book is the misunderstanding, perhaps close to being a myth, that Muslim communities in London were either complicit in or ignorant of this, you know, the sense in which, perhaps rightly or wrongly, but I think, you know, Abu Qatada throughout the 90s was widely understood to have a very important and negative impact here. And the truth is that it was the, you know, much maligned Salafis in Brixton who took him on and went toe to toe with him and did the same with some of his henchmen. And so I suppose my regret is, I think it's a failure of community intelligence. I think in the 1990s, a lot of this was there, you know, was within our grasp. It had, you know, I think in that sense, the idea to start the Muslim contact unit. I think it was probably, it would have been better for all concerned if we'd had that idea 6 years earlier. There's always an interesting preference in the counter-terrorist world, security world, for more, what's the phrase? This isn't the phrase, but more top secret intelligence. And yet often, you know, and what I tend to find in the book, you know, there's an awful lot in London throughout the 90s and past 9/11 that was, you know, more freely available, and therefore, again, I think that's an important lesson still, I think, when we're going ahead and when we, you know, we hear discussions with the new Met Police Commissioner about styles of policing. I think there is no substitute for really good, effective local community policing, whether it's being done by uniformed bobbies or whether it's being done by special branch detectives who are working locally. You know, I think it may well be, you know, post Arab Spring and the way things are going anyway for what we used to understand of as Al-Qaeda, it may well be that things are going to become more localized, and if anything, I think that the need for really a good local picture will probably remain.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
Simon Dermot from the Home Office. Can you tell me, as an ex-member of the Met Special Branch, how you feel about Boris Johnson's recent statement that he thinks they should, in future, not hold that remit nationally?
Right. Well, of course, this is strange. I must admit, I wasn't aware of Boris's statement, but of course, it's odd because Met Police Special Branch ended in 2006. So Met Police Special Branch, which you might refer to as the mother of all special branches, runs from 1883 to 2006, and then, to all intents and purposes, it's finished. So it's a strange anomaly that special branches around the country continue. I don't. So therefore, I'm not quite sure if. I wonder if Boris Johnson understands that.
So do I.
Okay. Right. Sorry. Yes, please.
Hi, Falan Kari from Saudi Arabia, I'm an independent researcher. You know, in Saudi Arabia, we suffered a lot from Al-Qaeda. But the difference is that we've always understood that the difference between real Islam and extremist Islam. And I think that after 9/11, the war on terrorism had a counter effect. And actually, Iraq also, after 2003, I've seen moderate Muslims turn into extremist Muslims, not in the sense of being like terrorists, but ideologically speaking, and Afghanistan as well. And what do you think? I mean, don't you think that the West and its policy had also to be blamed in a way for creating these, I mean...
Yes, well, I do, in the book, I do talk about the war on terror having an unintended consequence, a sense of promoting counterproductive counter-terrorism. And I think, although some of it may well be unintended, I think equally some of it should have been foreseen. You know, when you're dealing with the real fundamentals here, it really doesn't matter what the motivation of the terrorist group is. All terrorist groups hope that a government will respond with draconian measures. And so we see, you know, Al-Qaeda spokesman rather pleased with the war on terror, because not only is it draconian, but it's also you know, harming communities where they would like to recruit. So I think over and above the issues of people, issues of morality, issues of human rights, actually, just in purely what is good counter-terrorism, what is effective and what is less effective, then it is quite striking, particularly from day one, that the war on terror seemed to ignore, rather willfully ignore, those lessons. It did so on the basis that this was an exceptional threat that required exceptional measures. But again, I think when we look back now, we can see that there's precious little evidence for that success, and there's quite a lot of evidence for the sort of thing you're suggesting, whereby people, well, young people, or not, young people, where aspects of the war on terror have either recruited them, or even, I think in many more cases, simply alienated them. You know, I used to find this when I was working in the police. Someone who could potentially help police enormously, work closely with police, but very reluctant to form a partnership because of, say, experiences, negative experiences that they had. That, well, if we were to take one, just quickly, one case, because I found myself last week in a panel discussion with Mozambique, who was detained in Guantanamo Bay. And one can immediately see that Mozambique is someone who could be a very productive partner with police, and yet I think you can see that his experiences are such, and many others are like him, where the last thing they want to do is to engage with some of my former colleagues in the police.
One last question. I think this will have to be the last.
I'm Cho, Asia and Pacific Affairs. It's a very general question. Phraseology. Some of my colleagues believe that the grandiose were like war on terror, war on drugs. How do you declare war on terror, on drugs? Would it be easier for the law enforcement organizations to do more in the angle of criminal parameters than declaring war on, say, drugs or terrorism? Just a question.
Yes, I think criminal proceedings can be hugely beneficial in sending out important signals. When, if we accept that there is always broadly a war for hearts and minds, we understand that, that terrorists want to win support, either active support or tacit support for their point of view, and it's the same for people in counter-terrorism. And there is nothing better, nothing sends out a stronger signal to the young people who can perhaps go one way or the other than a very fair trial, a very, very visible trial where, and if at the end of it, someone like, as he was, someone like Abu Hamza is convicted by a judge and jury, well, that's the best kind of justice anyone can have, and it then makes the work of the sort of work I was doing, it makes our work much easier, much harder to do our kind of work if people are disappearing and ending up in places like Guantanamo Bay.
Bob, thank you very much indeed. It's been a very interesting session. Speaking as somebody who has spent many hundreds of hours on the Victoria line, seldom having found it a particularly enjoyable or uplifting experience, I think from now on I will regard it in a somewhat different light. So if nothing else, thank you for that. And please can I invite everyone in applauding our speaker. Thank you.